This happened to me, and even now it feels strange to put it into words. These memories come from the time when I still lived back home. I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, before life eventually took me to the UK. Back then, my world was smaller, familiar, and in many ways predictable. I never imagined that one ordinary evening would leave a mark on me that I still carry years later. Our home was in a busy part of the city, surrounded by houses, shops, and government buildings. There was one building nearby that we all assumed was just another dull office used by some department or the other. It blended in so well that none of us ever questioned it. We didn't know that it was connected to the CID, the Police Investigation Department. To us, it was just a quiet structure we passed every day without a second thought. On the 11th of November 2010, the day began like any other. I went to work, did my job, and by the time evening came around, I was tired in the usual way. As I was heading back home, I thought about stopping by the gym. The gym wasn't far at all, only a short walk from my house. It had a sauna, and after a long, exhausting day, the idea of relaxing there sounded perfect. Instead of taking my bike or calling a ride, I decided to walk. I reached home, changed quickly, and stepped back outside. The air felt normal. The street was alive with the usual sounds of traffic, people talking, and distant horns. Nothing felt wrong. I started walking toward the gym, thinking about nothing more serious than my workout and how good it would feel to unwind afterward. I had been walking for maybe 10 minutes. I was very close to the gym, less than a few minutes away. Then, without any warning at all, everything changed. For a split second, it felt like the ground itself moved. It was so quick that my mind barely had time to register it. The next moment, there was a sound so loud that it felt less like something I heard and more like something that hit me. It was the loudest noise I have ever experienced in my life. At the same time, a powerful force slammed into my chest, knocking the air out of me completely. The pain and pressure were overwhelming. My ears rang violently, and I could feel warm liquid running down the sides of my face. I later realized my ears had started bleeding from the sheer force of the blast. It felt as if something massive had struck me head-on, pushing me backward without mercy. I fell to the ground, confused and in pain, instinctively covering my ears. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Dust filled the air, and everything around me felt unreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare without warning. I lay there, trying to breathe, trying to understand what had just happened. As I slowly became aware of my surroundings, I noticed that car alarms were going off everywhere. The noise blended into one constant, chaotic sound. I looked around and saw broken glass scattered across the street. Windows from nearby buildings were shattered, even ones far away from where I was lying. It felt impossible that so much destruction could come from a single moment. A strange smell filled the air. It was sharp and heavy, unlike anything I had smelled before. It reminded me of burning metal mixed with smoke, something that made my stomach turn. That smell stayed with me, and even now, certain scents can bring me right back to that moment. Debris was falling from above, landing on the street and nearby rooftops. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to see clearly. I pushed myself up slowly, brushing dirt from my clothes, my body still shaking. My ears were still in pain, and my head felt foggy, as if I was moving through water. As I steadied myself, I heard screams. They came from ahead, down the street, where people were gathering. The sound of panic and fear was unmistakable. I forced myself to move in that direction, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, I noticed damage everywhere. Walls were cracked, some split wide open. Parts of buildings had collapsed, and the shock wave had left deep marks on structures that were once solid. It felt like the area had been torn apart in seconds. When I finally reached the center of the destruction, the scene before me didn't feel real. It looked like something from a disaster movie, except this wasn't a screen. This was real life. Cars were damaged and burning. People were lying on the ground, some crying, some calling out for help. Others were completely still. It was then that the truth hit me. This was a bomb blast. The building we had always thought was ordinary was gone. In its place was a massive crater, filled with water and debris. The structure that once stood there had been completely erased. The force of the explosion had changed the entire area beyond recognition. I stood there in shock, unable to fully process what I was seeing. There were injured people everywhere. Some were trying to help others despite their own wounds. The air was filled with cries, sirens in the distance, and the crackling sound of fire. One image in particular burned itself into my memory. I saw a woman on the ground, screaming and crying, completely broken. She was holding on to what remained of her husband, unable to accept what had happened. Her pain was raw and unbearable to witness. It was the kind of grief that doesn't need words. I saw others who had been badly hurt. Their lives changed forever in that instant. Some people lay still, their faces empty, as if frozen in time. I felt helpless, standing there among the chaos, not knowing how to help or where to begin. Then I saw a young man, no older than 20. He was lying on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural way. His eyes were open, and they seemed to be staring straight at me. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt like he was looking into me, as if trying to say something without words. That image never left me. Eventually, the police arrived, followed by emergency services and the media. The area grew crowded, and I felt myself being pushed away by the movement of people. Still in shock, I made my way back home as night began to fall. From the outside, everything looked the same as it always had, but inside, nothing was normal anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the explosion again. I heard the sound, felt the pressure, smelled the smoke. For weeks after that, my nights were haunted. Almost every night, I would wake up in terror, convinced that I wasn't alone. I would see the face of that young man from the blast, standing silently in my hallway or doorway, staring at me. He never spoke. He never moved. He just stood there, looking at me with the same empty expression I had seen that day. I knew, deep down, that it was my mind reacting to the trauma, but that didn't make it feel any less real. The fear was intense, and the images were vivid. Sleep became something I feared instead of welcomed. Over time, the visions faded, but the memory never did. Even now, years later, loud noises still affect me. A sudden bang, fireworks, or even heavy bass from music can make my heart race. For a brief moment, I am back on that street in Karachi, feeling the ground shake beneath my feet. I'm married now, and sometimes when a loud sound startles me, I tell my wife that it reminded me of something from my past. I don't go into detail. I keep most of it inside. But in those moments, I silently pray that no one else ever has to experience something like that. Not in real life. Not even in their worst dreams. Some events don't end when they're over. They stay with you, quietly shaping the way you see the world. And this is one memory I know will never truly leave me. It was a true story, one that spread quietly through people who lived in similar neighborhoods, passed along in low voices because it touched something deeply unsettling that many already feared. It wasn't about monsters or ghosts in the usual sense. It was about walls, thin walls, and how close strangers can really be without us ever truly knowing them. The woman lived alone in a row house neighborhood, the kind where homes were pressed tightly together, sharing walls on either side. From the outside, everything looked ordinary. The houses all followed the same pattern, narrow and tall, with small front steps and basements that ran beneath them like hidden tunnels. Inside, her home felt safe enough. She worked a regular job, kept a routine, and enjoyed the quiet independence of living alone. Like many row houses, the basement was separated from the neighbor's basement by nothing more than a simple brick wall. It wasn't thick or reinforced, just an old dividing structure put in place decades ago. She rarely thought about it. To her, the basement was just a place for storage, laundry, and the low hum of pipes. Her neighbor, however, was hard to ignore. He was a strange man, known in the neighborhood for keeping odd hours. While most people slept, he stayed awake. Through the shared wall, she could hear noises late at night. Footsteps pacing back and forth, muffled sounds that didn't seem to have a clear purpose, and occasional thuds that echoed in a way that made her pause. At first, she brushed it off. Shared walls always carried sound, and she told herself that this was just what came with living so close to other people. Over time, though, the noises became harder to ignore. Sometimes there were long stretches of silence followed by sudden activity in the middle of the night. Other times, it sounded like he was moving heavy objects or working on something for hours. She tried not to think about it. She didn't want to label him as dangerous just because he was odd. There were moments when his behavior crossed into something more uncomfortable. On some nights, he would pound on the wall between their houses for no clear reason. The sound would jolt her awake, her heart racing as she lay still in the dark, listening. When she didn't respond, the pounding would eventually stop. When she left for work in the mornings or returned home in the evenings, she sometimes felt his eyes on her. He would stand just inside his doorway or near a window, watching in a way that made her skin crawl. He never said anything directly threatening, never did anything that could easily be reported. It was subtle enough that she doubted herself, wondering if she was just being paranoid. So she carried on. Days passed, then weeks. She went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and tried to live her life as normally as possible. The strange noises continued, but they became part of the background of her routine. She told herself that people were allowed to be strange, that shared living meant accepting a certain level of discomfort. Then one day, she didn't show up to work. At first, her co-workers assumed she was sick or had taken a day off. When she didn't call, they waited. By the second day, concern started to grow. This wasn't like her. She was responsible, reliable, and always informed someone if she was going to be absent. After several days with no word from her, her workplace contacted the authorities and asked for a wellness check. When the police arrived at her row house, the front door was closed. There was no sign of forced entry. Inside, the house was quiet. Her belongings were still there. There were no obvious signs that she had packed up or left town. It looked as though she had simply vanished in the middle of her life. The officers searched room by room, calling out her name. No answer came. As they moved closer to the basement, they noticed something strange. From below, they could hear the sound of a power tool running. It was steady and unmistakable, the high-pitched whine of an electric saw. The sound didn't make sense. She wasn't home, and no one had reported maintenance work. The officers exchanged looks and followed the noise down into the basement. The sound grew louder as they descended the stairs. In the back of the basement, they noticed that part of the brick wall separating her basement from the neighbors had been altered. Several bricks were missing, creating a rough opening just large enough to see through. Dust and debris lay scattered on the floor, as if the wall had been worked on recently. Cautiously, the officers peered through the opening. What they saw on the other side made them step back immediately. In the neighbor's basement, the man was standing over a body. The scene was chaotic and horrifying, clear evidence of a violent crime. The woman who had been reported missing was there. There was no doubt about it. The officers acted quickly. They moved around to the neighbor's entrance and took him into custody without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply went along with them, his expression empty and distant, as if he had already checked out of reality. They placed him in the back of a police vehicle and transported him to the station. When they arrived and opened the back door, they found that the man was no longer alive. In the short time between his arrest and arrival, he had taken his own life, leaving behind no explanation, no answers, and no chance for anyone to understand why he had done what he did. The investigation confirmed what the officers had already feared. The thin wall between the basements had been the key. The neighbor had quietly removed bricks over time, creating access between the two homes. All the late-night noises, the pounding, the strange behavior, it had all been warning signs hiding in plain sight. For those who heard the story later, it stayed with them in a way few others did. Anyone who had ever lived in an apartment, a duplex, or a row house felt it settle deep in their chest. The idea that someone could be that close, separated by nothing more than a fragile wall, was terrifying. It made people think twice about the sounds they ignored, the behaviors they explained away, and the uneasy feelings they chose to dismiss. The story didn't rely on imagination or the supernatural. That was what made it so powerful. It was real. It was possible. And it reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most frightening things are not hidden in the dark, but living quietly right next door. I remember this story so clearly, even though I was just a kid when I first read it. It came from one of those scary story anthologies meant for children, the kind you could buy at the Scholastic Book Fair at school. Back then, those book fairs felt magical. Tables covered in shiny paperbacks, colorful covers, and just enough spooky artwork to make your heart beat faster without getting you in trouble with teachers or parents. I begged for that book, and when I finally got it, I read it over and over, not knowing it would follow me for the rest of my life. The story itself seemed simple at first. It was about a young girl, not much older than I was at the time, who loved puzzles. One afternoon, she wandered into a small second-hand store. The place smelled like old paper and dust, and everything inside felt slightly forgotten. Shelves leaned under the weight of used books, cracked picture frames, and old toys missing pieces. That kind of store always feels quiet in a strange way, like it's holding on to memories it doesn't want to share. While browsing, the girl noticed a jigsaw puzzle sitting on a low shelf near the back. The box was plain, with faded colors and no clear picture on the front, just a vague image that didn't really make sense. Something about it caught her attention. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to it. The price was cheap, and even though she didn't recognize the brand or the image, she decided to buy it. When she got home, the house was quiet. It was one of those afternoons where the light outside is dull and gray, making everything indoors feel a little dimmer. She went to her room, cleared some space on her desk, and opened the puzzle box. Inside were dozens of small cardboard pieces, all mixed together. Nothing seemed unusual at first. She began sorting the pieces by color and shape, just like she always did. As she connected the first few pieces, she noticed something odd. The colors looked familiar. The shades of the walls, the furniture, even the pattern of the carpet seemed strangely recognizable. She brushed the thought aside, telling herself it was just coincidence. After all, lots of rooms looked the same. As more pieces came together, the feeling grew stronger. The picture wasn't random at all. It was a room. Her room. The desk, the chair, the bed in the corner, even the small details like a book left open on the floor. The puzzle was showing her own bedroom. Her heart began to beat faster, but she kept going. She told herself it must be based on a common design, or maybe she was imagining things. Still, the more she worked, the more exact it became. The angle of the light, the way the shadows fell across the floor, even the way her lamp leaned slightly to one side. Everything matched perfectly. Then she noticed something that made her hands shake. In the picture, there was a girl sitting at the desk, working on a puzzle. The girl looked exactly like her. Same hair, same clothes, same posture. The image showed her as she was at that very moment. She pulled her hands back from the puzzle and stared at it for a long time. Her room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. She looked up from the puzzle and around her real room, then back down again. The position of the chair, the angle of her arms, everything lined up. It was as if the puzzle wasn't just a picture, but a frozen moment pulled straight from reality. Fear crept in slowly, like cold air seeping through a crack. She thought about stopping, about putting the puzzle back in the box and shoving it under her bed. But curiosity was stronger. She needed to know. With trembling fingers, she picked up another piece and fitted into place. As the image neared completion, she noticed a dark shape forming in the background. It was behind her, in the puzzle image, near the window. At first, it was just a blur, something that didn't quite belong. She leaned closer, squinting at it. The shape slowly became clearer. It was a face, pale and twisted, with eyes that seemed far too focused, far too aware. The expression on the face was wrong in a way that's hard to describe. It wasn't just scary. It felt personal, like it was looking directly at her. Not the version of her in the puzzle, but the real her. Her chest felt tight. She could feel her pulse in her ears. She didn't want to place the final piece. but she knew what it was. The last piece completed the face in the window. When she finally pressed it into place, the puzzle was finished. The image was perfect. Her room, her body, her exact position, and behind her in the window, that horrifying face staring in. For a moment, she couldn't move. She sat there, frozen, staring down at the completed puzzle. Her mind raced, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had seen her room before. Maybe it was just a story meant to scare her. Then she remembered the window. Slowly, her fear growing with every second, she turned her head to look at the real window behind her. She expected to see nothing. She hoped to see nothing. She prayed that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the story didn't give her that comfort. The face was there too. That final line hit me like nothing else I had ever read as a child. It was simple, short, and absolutely devastating. No explanation, no escape. Just the realization that what she saw in the puzzle wasn't a warning, it was a reflection. Even now, decades later, that story has never left me. I'm almost 40 years old, and I still think about it when I sit near a window at night. I still get uneasy when I see my reflection in dark glass, when the room behind me fades into shadow. I still feel that childhood fear crawl up my spine when I imagine something watching from the other side. What makes the story so powerful isn't monsters or violence. It's the idea that something knows exactly where you are, exactly what you're doing, and that you won't realize it until it's already looking back at you. That sense of being observed, of reality quietly slipping out of your control, is what stayed with me all these years. I don't think I ever finished that book in one sitting again. I read that story once, maybe twice, and then avoided it. But it didn't matter. It was already burned into my memory. The image of a quiet room, a harmless puzzle, and a face in the window followed me long after I closed the book. To this day, windows still scare me. Not because I expect to see something every time, but because I remember how easily a normal moment can turn wrong. How something ordinary can suddenly reveal something watching from just beyond the glass, waiting to be noticed. I still think about that day more often than I'd like to admit. It's the kind of memory that doesn't shout or jump out at you, but quietly waits in the background, ready to surface when you're standing in a parking lot, or when a stranger smiles a little too confidently at your child. It's terrifying not because it feels like a horror story, but because it feels so painfully possible. It was an ordinary day. That's the part that makes it hardest to process. My husband and I had gone to the supermarket together, our baby bundled safely in her car seat. She was still very young then, soft and warm and new to the world, with chubby cheeks that made strangers smile and a tiny mouth that curved into the sweetest grin even in her sleep. We were tired in that specific way new parents are tired, but we were happy. Nothing about that day felt wrong. While we were shopping, our baby became fussy. It happens, of course. Babies cry, and sometimes nothing works except motion. So my husband offered to take her for a short drive around the block. Usually, the gentle hum of the car and the movement would settle her almost instantly. I stayed behind to finish shopping, expecting he'd be back before I even reached the checkout. It only took about 10 minutes for her to calm down. By the time she had settled into a deep nap, my husband realized I was probably still inside the store. The reception inside that building is terrible, so calling or texting wasn't reliable. Instead of driving home, he pulled back into the parking lot and parked. The weather was unusually pleasant for that time of year, warm and bright, so he decided to take her out of the car and sit on one of the benches just outside the store. He placed her carrier gently on the bench beside him and absent-mindedly rocked it with his foot, the way parents do without even thinking. He took a business call, his attention split between the conversation and the soft rhythm of keeping our baby asleep. Everything felt normal, safe, public, boring, even. Then a woman approached. She looked completely unremarkable in the way that actually makes someone feel more trustworthy. She was well dressed, probably in her mid-30s, average height, fit, confident. The kind of person you wouldn't look twice at in a grocery store parking lot. The kind of person you assume belongs there. People often stop to admire our baby. It's something we've gotten used to. She has that kind of face, the kind that invites comments and smiles. Usually, it's harmless. But we are careful about her sleep schedule, and my husband was already preparing to politely tell the woman that the baby was napping and couldn't be disturbed. He didn't even get the chance. The woman walked directly toward them, calm and sure of herself, and before he could finish his sentence, she reached down, picked up the carrier, and started walking away. For a split second, his brain refused to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. It didn't make sense. People don't do that. Not in daylight. Not in a busy parking lot. Not so casually. So at first, he reacted the way anyone might when reality lags behind shock. He said, "Excuse me, put her down," his voice rising as panic rushed in. The woman didn't look back. She didn't run, but she walked faster. Her calm never broke. That's when my husband ran after her. He tried to grab the carrier, tried to stop her, and when that didn't work, he reached for her arms, desperate and terrified. That's when everything turned inside out. The woman began screaming. She yelled words that flipped the situation instantly, loudly, clearly, and with terrifying precision. She shouted that he was trying to take her baby. She screamed for help. She yelled about kidnapping. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small pink bottle of pepper spray, waving it like proof of her fear. To anyone watching, the story was obvious. A man in a graphic t-shirt struggling with a well-dressed woman. A baby between them. Her screams cutting through the air. Someone tackled my husband from behind. Another person held him down. Voices rose around them, angry and protective and sure. No one had seen how it started. No one questioned her confidence. My husband was trying to explain, begging them to listen, but his words were drowned out. People were shouting at him to stop resisting, to lie still, to wait for the police. They told the woman she should press charges. She acted shaken, fragile, grateful for the help, and said she just wanted to go home. She was driving a minivan. That detail still makes my stomach twist. My husband realized, in that moment, that the crowd around him was helping her, that they were doing exactly what she needed them to do. He was watching his daughter being taken away while strangers held him down and told him he was a criminal. In a moment of panic and desperation, he tried to prove the truth the only way he could think of. He shouted that he had pictures of the baby on his phone. It came out wrong. Of course it did. People recoiled. Someone accused him of being sick. One man kicked him hard in the ribs, believing he was stopping something monstrous. That was when I came out of the store. I saw the crowd first. I saw my husband on the ground. I thought he was being robbed. My heart started racing so fast it felt like it might tear out of my chest. I screamed for security, but my voice came out thin and broken. I ran toward him, waving my wallet, begging them to take whatever they wanted and leave us alone. Someone told me they were waiting for the police. That didn't make sense. Why would muggers call the police? Then someone said it. They said my husband had tried to abduct a woman's child. The words didn't register at first. I thought I'd misheard. I looked at my husband's face, terrified and bruised, and I knew something was very wrong. I turned, scanning the parking lot, searching for our baby. I saw the woman halfway across the lot, walking away with the carrier. Something primal took over. I don't remember deciding to move. I don't remember thinking. I kicked off my shoes and ran. I don't know how fast I went. I don't know what I looked like. I only knew one thing. That was my baby. I reached her and grabbed her hair, my hand shaking but strong with fear. I wrapped my other arm around her throat, not to hurt her, but to stop her. She struggled. She was stronger than I expected. She almost got away. Then she dropped the carrier. I threw myself over it, covering it with my body, shaking and silent. The woman walked away. No one stopped her. Not one person chased her. Not one person questioned why a mother would leave without her child. The police arrived shortly after. Even then, even after everything, Some people still told them that my husband was the problem, that he was the danger. The questions the police asked me weren't about finding her. They were about whether I really wanted to pursue anything, about understanding her side, about letting it go. That's the part that keeps me up at night. Not just that someone tried to take my baby, but how easily it almost worked. How confidence, timing, and a crowd's assumptions nearly destroyed our family in the middle of a sunny afternoon. I don't tell this story to scare people for fun. I tell it because it's real, because it could happen anywhere. Because sometimes the most terrifying things don't lurk in shadows or wait until night. Sometimes they walk right up to you, smile, and take what you love while everyone else helps them do it. Even after the immediate panic was over, the aftermath of that day didn't end in the parking lot. We left with our baby safe in my arms, but the feeling of utter disbelief and exhaustion followed us home. My husband's body ached, not just from the physical blows he'd taken from the strangers who thought they were helping, but from the invisible weight of helplessness that settled on him in that moment. It was as if the world had turned upside down in those few minutes, and even after regaining our daughter, nothing felt normal. The first thing we encountered at the police station was a barrage of questions, though almost none were what you might expect in a case of attempted kidnapping. Officers seemed more concerned about whether our baby really belonged to us. "Do your husband and the baby look dissimilar?" one officer asked. "Is there a chance she thought he was abducting the baby and was just trying to intervene?" Another suggested, almost casually, that perhaps my husband had been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that made her feel compelled to step in. Their tone wasn't accusatory exactly. It was bureaucratic, detached, as if their job was to check every possible box before even considering the reality. Someone even asked if the woman had seemed groggy or confused, maybe mistaking our daughter for her own child, rather than acknowledging the obvious. She had no right to take our baby in the first place. It was infuriating. We were still shaken, our hearts still racing from the adrenaline that hadn't fully subsided. The officers spent more time verifying our story than expressing concern about what had actually happened. The fact that a stranger had brazenly tried to walk off with our baby in broad daylight. It felt like we were being treated as if we were part of the problem. At that point, my husband called his brother, who works in an office full of lawyers, hoping for guidance. His brother immediately connected us to someone with experience in situations like this. The advice was clear, precise, and crucial. Get every officer's name and badge number. Request copies of the store's security footage as soon as possible. Escalate the complaint higher up the chain of command if officers weren't taking the case seriously. It was practical, legal, and grounding advice in the midst of the chaos. We followed that advice immediately. The moment we got home, we locked ourselves inside, holding our baby close while we went through the motions. My husband sat down heavily on the couch, hands pressed to his face, shaking as the reality of what had happened fully hit him. I sat beside him, gripping his arm, trying to ground him and myself at the same time. We cried, tears spilling freely, unable to articulate anything but fear and relief in the same breath. When the fog of panic cleared slightly, we had to step back into the world. Our older children were finishing school soon, and we had to prepare for their arrival. We wrapped ourselves tightly in the normal rhythms of life, making sure everyone was fed, homework was done, and the house functioned normally. Yet, underneath it all, the memory of that day was still present. The woman walking confidently away with our sleeping baby, the strangers pressing down on my husband, the disbelieving stares, and the constant gnawing thought of what could have happened if we had been just seconds slower. My husband's anger and helplessness were palpable for weeks afterward. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. The calm, confident demeanor of the woman, the way the bystanders assumed he was the criminal, the kick to his ribs that left him bruised and in pain. He grappled with the knowledge that, for all practical purposes, a stranger could have taken our child in front of dozens of people, and only by sheer luck and quick thinking did it end with her safe. The police, to their credit, eventually began taking our statements more seriously, but the process was maddeningly slow. They asked repeatedly if we wanted to press charges against the bystanders or the woman. My husband declined to press charges against the man who had kicked him, despite the cracked ribs, understanding that the man had genuinely believed he was preventing a kidnapping. Still, it was hard not to feel that justice had been twisted somehow, like the system was designed to balance guilt rather than protect the innocent. And yet, even after the formalities were handled, the lingering tension in the world remained. Some people who had witnessed the incident refused to acknowledge what had happened. Even days later, individuals who were at the store gave my husband dirty looks, muttering to themselves as though he was still a threat. One man even implored the officers to involve Child Protective Services to verify that our baby truly belonged to us, despite all evidence to the contrary. Their skepticism was exhausting and surreal, a cruel reminder that perception often matters more than reality. We learned quickly that being a parent means living with a constant undercurrent of vigilance. But that day taught us that vigilance alone is not always enough. You can hold your baby close, teach them safety rules, and avoid obvious dangers, yet still be at the mercy of someone else's audacity. That realization, small but profound, left us hyper-aware of our surroundings for weeks. Every stranger approaching our car in a parking lot, every quick movement toward our children, set off alarms in our minds. What had been ordinary public spaces became tense zones of calculation, even when nothing happened. Over time, the fear mixed with gratitude. Our daughter had been safe. We had each other. The lessons in law, procedure, and parental instincts were all invaluable, though learned in the most terrifying way possible. We became more deliberate in our routines, never leaving the baby unattended in public, keeping phone calls minimal when in a crowd, and always assessing the intentions of strangers before letting our guard down. and still, the memory of the day remains sharp, not as a story to tell lightly, but as a reminder of how quickly normal life can fracture, how quickly assumptions and misunderstandings can escalate to near tragedy, and how fragile the bubble of safety truly is when you are responsible for another human being. We walk in the world differently now, aware of the confidence that some people wear like armor, the assumptions that bystanders can make, and the importance of acting decisively when seconds matter. Sometimes, when I see strangers approaching a stroller or a young child in a store, I feel my heartbeat spike, my palms go cold, and I am instantly transported back to that sunny parking lot. My husband still tenses when someone gets too close to our children. The adrenaline fades slowly, but it never disappears entirely. Even after all the police reports, the security footage requests, and the reassurances of friends and family, there is a lingering understanding. That day could have ended differently. And the people who were meant to protect us, the bystanders, the initial responding officers, could have easily amplified the danger instead of mitigating it. That stark reality is hard to shake. It is also the way we tell the story now. Carefully, in detail, with emphasis on both the terror and the lessons learned. It serves as a warning to other parents, to anyone who has a child, and to anyone who assumes safety is guaranteed simply because it is daylight or because there are strangers around. Confidence, audacity, and a lack of consequence can turn an ordinary day into something unthinkably dangerous. We live with the knowledge that a casual misunderstanding, a stranger's audacity, and the assumptions of bystanders could have led to catastrophe. But we also live with the proof that quick thinking, instinct, and an unwillingness to let fear paralyze us can save what matters most. The story isn't just about what happened in that parking lot. It's about vigilance, awareness, and trust. It's about the responsibility we carry as parents, and the terrifying reality that the world doesn't always recognize that responsibility. And it's about the fact that sometimes the people who should be helping are just as capable of making the situation worse. We tell this story to remind ourselves, and anyone who will listen, that ordinary days can harbor extraordinary dangers, and that the strength of parental instincts, when combined with decisive action, can be the difference between disaster and safety. It remains one of the most vivid, frightening, and life-changing experiences we've ever faced, and its lessons will stay with us forever. In the early years of the 21st century, the world had changed quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, until you woke up one day and realized that life as you had known it no longer existed. Technology had seeped into every corner of human existence. Corporations had grown beyond the boundaries of the cities, creating enclaves where money, influence, and genetic potential mattered more than anything else. It was a time when people didn't just modify their appearances with cosmetic surgery or digital enhancements. They could rewrite themselves entirely, become someone else if they wanted, or something else. The process was called being informed. And it was the kind of thing that belonged in the shadows of society, whispered about in neon-lit back alleys or the grimy cubicles of downtown arcologies. I first heard about it from a friend, Pinky, who had a certain effortless way of existing that made you want to follow her everywhere, even when you knew you probably shouldn't. She moved through the city like she owned it, wearing a look of constant amusement, her hair colored in streaks of violet and silver that reflected the neon lights of the streets at night. One evening, over coffee in a little cafe that still smelled of warm pastries and wet concrete, she mentioned casually that she had undergone the process. She had been informed as a woman, she said, and it had changed everything about her. At first, I thought she was joking. I didn't realize it was serious until she described the vats, the sensors lining the walls, the hum of the machines as they rewrote the very blueprint of her body. She said the sensation was disorienting at first, like drowning in silk water, and then waking up in your own body, but not quite. She laughed when she recounted the first few hours afterward, feeling both herself and not herself at the same time. It was intoxicating, listening to her. And in the strange way that young people often do, reckless and curious and craving novelty, I wanted to try it too. Not to become a woman, not exactly, though there was a part of me that thought that would be interesting, but to see what it meant to step beyond the limits of human form. A few weeks later, another friend and I found ourselves walking down a narrow side street, the kind with walls plastered with old posters and neon advertisements flickering intermittently. We were heading toward a small, nondescript shop that promised discretion and transformation. The man who ran it looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed red, his hands shaking as he handled the controls of the vat. He spoke quickly, almost nervously, warning us about the risks. "It's not a game," he said. "Once you go in, there's no real undoing it. You can't just flip a switch and go back. You'll still be human enough to think, to feel, to communicate, but your body, your instincts, will take over in ways you can't anticipate. Some people come back, some don't." We nodded, pretending to understand, though the truth was, we didn't. We wanted the experience. We wanted to push boundaries. We joked about becoming cats, birds, even fish, but ultimately, after a long conversation that felt more like daring ourselves than making a serious decision, we settled on becoming dogs, just for a day, just to see what it felt like. It was supposed to be temporary, fun, an absurd lark. The vat hummed, the lights above casting an eerie, sterile glow over the room. We stripped down, climbed inside, and let the nanotech liquid wrap around us. The first few moments were like floating in warm water, nothing happening, and then, slowly, everything shifted. My body, my hands, my balance, it was all wrong. My senses exploded all at once. I could hear the softest heartbeat across the room, smell the faint oil on the machine, feel the vibration of the floor as my friend moved nearby. Our laughter, muffled and high-pitched, came from somewhere else entirely, as if we were listening to our own bodies as strangers. When it was done, we staggered out of the vat, and the world felt different. The city was overwhelming. Every scent, every movement, every sound became intensely vivid. We could feel the wind along our fur, the rough edges of pavement under paws that weren't ours before, the smell of food and exhaust and asphalt mixing together. We tried to speak, and only garbled, animalistic noises came out. We barked, whimpered, yipped, an absurd language that we understood but could not translate. Our minds were still ours, but our bodies no longer obeyed the familiar laws. We ran in the alleyways, chasing shadows, sniffing the cracks in the sidewalk where trash and grime accumulated. The freedom was intoxicating, almost magical, until we realized just how fragile our humanity had become. The shopkeeper had warned us, but no warning can truly prepare you for the feeling of being something else entirely, even for a few hours. And then it happened. The world changed again, but not by our choice. Someone came back, someone angry, someone who hated what the shop was doing. The air was thick with tension before we even noticed, a sense of danger that pricked our instincts sharper than anything else. We could hear the doors crashing, the alarm of a fire, the scraping of metal as the attacker forced their way in. Screams and shouts filled the small room. The shopkeeper tried to intervene, but he was no match. The chaos was total. We ran instinctively, paws moving faster than they had any right to. We tried to hide, but the familiar alleyways felt like cages, the streets a maze of obstacles and threats. Behind us, the shop's destruction echoed, machines shattering, vats rupturing, sparks flying as the attacker destroyed everything in sight. Our home, our chance to return to normality, was gone. By the time the chaos subsided, the shopkeeper was dead, and we were trapped. The nanotech had no way to reverse itself. We were stuck. The world we had known, human, ordinary, fleetingly mortal, was gone. We could think, we could reason, but our bodies betrayed us constantly. The sunlight on the pavement felt foreign. A human touch, impossible. Communication with others, impossible except for the faintest gestures. Pinky, our friend who had been informed first, had gone on to live her life fully. She had embraced her new form, her happiness radiating in every encounter. Her transformation had been purposeful, intentional, and complete. She had wanted something beyond the human shell, and she had it. But for us, the two young men who had wanted nothing more than to taste the freedom of canine form for a few hours, there was no joy, no satisfaction, only the slow, creeping despair of permanence. When I think back to the story of O-Face, the memory still curls in my stomach like smoke, faint and persistent, almost like a dream that never quite leaves you. I first heard it in second grade, in a small classroom with high windows that let the late afternoon sun spill over the wooden floors. our librarian, an older woman with kind eyes but a quiet intensity, had that way of speaking that made the world feel both larger and smaller at the same time, like she could pull entire universes into a single room. She told the story during one of those calm reading sessions, where the noise of the playground and the chatter of classmates faded into something soft and distant. She leaned slightly on the edge of the teacher's desk, her fingers tracing the spines of books stacked behind her as if gathering the courage to tell something that was both playful and serious. "This is a story you don't forget," she said softly. And that was enough to make the room go still, every child leaning forward, unknowingly holding their breath. The story began simply enough. There was a child, much like any of us, mischievous in ways small and ordinary, but with that spark of curiosity and defiance that seemed innocent at first. The child would play tricks on younger siblings, ignore their parents' warnings, and sneak around corners when told not to. Nothing terrible happened immediately, of course. The house was quiet in the day, sun spilling through the windows, and the sounds of laughter and distant barking from the neighbor's yard filled the air. Yet the librarian's voice held a note of warning, a reminder that there was a line, a point beyond which the world could change in ways the child couldn't imagine. "Oh, face," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "is always watching. You cannot see it, not unless it wants you to. But it knows when you're misbehaving, when you're being careless, when you're being naughty." She paused for effect, glancing at the room, letting her words settle in. We all leaned closer, some of us instinctively gripping the edges of our desks. The child in the story was warned, of course. Parents and grandparents, knowing the tales passed down over generations, tried to teach caution with stories of "Oh, face." But children, she explained, often ignore warnings. That was part of what made the story frightening. The certainty that rules, however lovingly given, could be broken, and consequences might follow, silent but inevitable. One evening, the child's grandmother became exasperated. The child had been defiant that day, refusing to go to bed, sneaking outside, and ignoring the small chores that were meant to teach responsibility. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the house dim and quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. The grandmother, in her own tired way, decided to show the child what could happen if misbehavior continued. She led the child outside to the front steps, a place where the world felt larger than it should, where the trees seemed to lean in and the shadows pooled like living things. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and falling leaves. Crickets chirped quietly, a gentle rhythm that made the silence between each sound even more noticeable. The grandmother's voice was calm but firm. "Oh, face," she called out, her words slicing through the quiet. "Come and take them away." The child's heart thumped in that strange, panicked rhythm only children know when they realize something might be happening that they don't understand. There was a pause, long and stretching, where the wind seemed to carry the echo of the call across the yard and into the woods beyond. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, there was movement, shuffling, a sound that wasn't quite human, not quite animal, something that belonged to the spaces between worlds. The first signs were subtle. The leaves stirred though there was no breeze. The branches rattled softly above the dark outline of the forest, and the child thought for a moment that perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks. But then came the footsteps, heavy, relentless, monstrous in a way that was impossible to ignore. They weren't close at first, not yet, just a faint echo in the distance. But each thud carried a weight, a promise that whatever it was coming. The child screamed, a short, sharp cry that mingled with the night. The sound seemed to make the footsteps grow louder, more confident, as though they were responding, feeding off the fear that had been invoked. The grandmother's hand was firm on the child's shoulder, steadying but not comforting. This was not a moment for comfort, she had said, only a lesson in consequences. And then the figure appeared. Not fully, not clearly, but enough that the child could sense it in the corner of their vision. A shape darker than night, taller than a man should be, with features obscured by shadow. The face, or what could be glimpsed of it, was featureless, a void, yet somehow expressive, as if it could see straight into the child's thoughts and intentions. The legend's name, O Face, made sense suddenly. There was no expression to read, yet 1,000 emotions pressed against the child's mind at once. Judgment, hunger, anticipation. The child's body froze. Fear, pure and raw, radiated from head to toe. Every instinct screamed to run, but running was impossible, trapped by the weight of invisible eyes and the certainty that this presence was no illusion. The footsteps grew closer, crunching over the gravel and fallen leaves, echoing in the still night as the darkness of the forest seemed to reach out, stretching, bending around the edges of the yard. The grandmother, in her calm, practiced way, said nothing, only waited, her voice absent except for the initial invocation. There was a long, tense silence as the world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the rapid beating of the child's heart, hammering in a panic that made every second stretch and warp. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the night erupted in sound. A scream, primal and full of terror, split the air, echoing across the yard and into the trees. The child was gone from the steps, swept away by the force that had been summoned. The forest seemed to shudder, the dark outline of O Face retreating, leaving only the impression that it had been there, that it had taken, that it had judged. The footsteps ran off into the woods, fading slowly, but the echo remained, a haunting imprint in the child's memory, a pulse that would never quite stop. The story ended there, abruptly, leaving the classroom in stunned silence. Some children whispered, trying to imagine what had just happened. Others sat rigid, staring at the librarian as if she might call out for O Face themselves. Even years later, I can still feel that tension, the careful pacing of the tale, the way it played on the thin line between discipline and dread. What made it haunting, even beyond the supernatural premise, was the certainty implied. O Face was not a story that promised fairness, or mercy, or even understanding. It existed as a shadow at the edges of behavior, a constant reminder that actions have consequences beyond what you can see or comprehend. The legend was small, yet terrifying, a symbol for the power adults have in shaping a child's world and the unknown dangers that can lie beyond the familiar. The imagery stuck with me for years. The front steps, slick with dew, the forest leaning in like it wanted to swallow everything, the sense of being watched and judged by something impossibly vast, impossibly silent. I would replay it in my mind late at night, lying awake as the house settled around me, the shadows stretching across the walls like the legs of a giant I could not see. The footsteps, the void where a face should have been, the scream carried in the cool air. All of it lingered, faint and persistent, like a slow, steady echo of a fear I could never fully escape. Even as an adult, the lesson of O Face feels strangely real. It isn't about monsters in the traditional sense, or violence, or gore. It is about accountability, about the unseen consequences of actions, about forces just beyond comprehension that observe, weigh, and act. And yet it is also a story of atmosphere, of the night, of shadows, of anticipation and the unknown. The fear is subtle, creeping, quiet, and all-encompassing. The kind of fear that wakes you in the middle of the night without reason, that makes ordinary spaces feel charged, dangerous, alive. I can still see the child on the steps, the cool wood beneath bare feet, the eyes wide and shining, the darkness stretching toward the forest, a blackness that seems to breathe and watch. I can still hear the scream echoing into the distance, even when the night is silent. I can still feel the pulse of that moment, the slow, creeping certainty that what was out there, what was called by name, was real in some way. The story is small, almost simple in its telling, but the impact is lasting. It is not the kind of terror that makes you jump once and forget. It seeps in quietly, attaches itself to memory, and lingers like the faintest touch on your shoulder. O Face is a legend designed to warn, to scare, to teach, but its power is that it never truly leaves you. And in that, it is more frightening than anything a ghost or monster could ever be. Even now, decades later, I still pause on quiet steps at night, glance at the edges of trees in the yard, or consider the shadows moving past a street lamp, and for a moment, the pulse of fear returns, soft but insistent. O Face is still there, somewhere, waiting, patient, and utterly impossible to see, until it chooses to make itself known. Nothing has ever truly haunted me in the way people usually describe fear. I was never the kind of child who had nightmares from horror movies or avoided dark hallways because of something I saw on screen. Horror, as a genre, never really frightened me. I grew up watching it before I even understood what it was supposed to do to you. Blood, monsters, ghosts, jump scares. All of that became familiar very early on, almost normal. Over time, I became desensitized to it, like background noise you stop noticing after a while. But there are ideas, certain concepts, that I have carried with me since childhood. They never scream or jump out at you. They don't rely on gore or loud noises. They sit quietly in your mind, waiting, growing heavier the older you get. Even now, as an adult, these thoughts return to me unexpectedly, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary day, and they still manage to unsettle me in a way no movie ever has. One of those ideas came from a moment in a story I encountered as a child. It wasn't even meant to be the scariest part. It wasn't a monster reveal or a violent scene. It was a simple line of dialogue, spoken almost casually, and yet it dug itself into my brain and never left. It was from it. There is a scene where the characters, now adults, meet again in a public place, a restaurant or hotel lobby, somewhere ordinary and calm. They sit together, talk about the past, about things they half remember and half don't. There is music playing, a pianist in the background, something gentle and pleasant. On the surface, everything is normal, familiar. They talk, they laugh a little, they exist in that moment like any group of people would. And then, as they leave, one of them stops and says something that feels completely out of place. Something like, "We just sat down, we listened to the music, we talked for a while." And yet I don't know if any of that was real. I don't know if it actually happened, or if I imagined it. That line hit me harder than anything else in the story. The idea that you can experience something so clearly, something that feels solid and shared, and then suddenly question whether it ever existed at all, it shook something loose in my mind. I remember thinking about it long after I closed the book or turned off the screen. I remember lying in bed and replaying that idea over and over. What if moments don't anchor themselves the way we think they do? What if memory and reality are not as tightly connected as we assumed? That question never really went away. As I grew older, that thought evolved. It stopped being about that one scene and started becoming something larger, something more unsettling. I began wondering what reality actually is when you strip it down to its basics. Is reality something external and fixed, or is it something our minds assemble moment by moment? If multiple people experience the same thing, does that make it real, or does it just mean they are sharing the same illusion? Consciousness itself started to feel strange to me. The idea that everything I experience, sight, sound, emotion, memory, is processed through a fragile biological system that can be altered, tricked, or damaged. If the brain decides something is real, then to that person, it is real. Fear, joy, pain, comfort, all of it exists because the mind says it does. That realization made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain to anyone else. Then there is the other part of it that stayed with me, quietly reinforcing those thoughts. The creature itself, a shape-shifting, sentient, intelligent being that can become anything, anyone. Something that doesn't just attack the body, but attacks perception. Something that understands you well enough to imitate what you trust, what you love, what you fear. A thing that doesn't just exist in the shadows, but inside your understanding of the world. That is far scarier to me than any monster with claws or teeth. Because how do you defend yourself against something that can distort reality itself? If a being can appear as a person you know, speak in a voice you recognize, behave in a way that feels familiar, then where does certainty come from? How do you know what is real and what is manipulation? How do you trust your own senses when they can be used against you? That idea loops back to the same question that seemed planted in my head years ago. Reality versus perceived reality. If something can convincingly control perception, then perception becomes unreliable. And if perception is unreliable, then reality itself becomes unstable. The ground you stand on is no longer solid. Everything becomes questionable. I've thought about that concept more times than I can count. Sometimes it spirals into something almost philosophical. What if consciousness is just a story the brain tells itself? What if reality is not a shared environment, but overlapping interpretations that happen to align most of the time? What happens when they don't? Other times, the thought takes a darker turn. What if you're already misremembering things? Conversations you swear happened, moments you feel certain about, emotions tied to specific memories. What if some of them were never real to begin with? Or worse, what if they were altered, reshaped, or replaced without you noticing? That is where the fear really lives for me. Not in monsters jumping out of closets, but in the quiet realization that the mind is both powerful and vulnerable. That it can protect you, but it can also betray you. That something intelligent enough, something patient enough, could exploit that weakness without ever needing to show its true form. I have never been afraid of horror movies themselves. I can watch them calmly, almost analytically, but certain ideas linger long after the screen goes dark. They sneak into your thoughts when you're alone, when the room is quiet, when your mind starts wandering. They don't demand attention. They wait for it. And when they surface, they feel disturbingly real. Sometimes I catch myself questioning small things. A conversation that felt important. Did it really happen the way I remember it? A memory from childhood. How much of it is accurate, and how much is reconstructed? Even the present moment can feel fragile when you think about it too long. You are experiencing it now, but the second it passes, it becomes memory. And memory is not a recording. It's an interpretation. That's the part that gets me. Reality feels solid only while you're inside it. The moment you step back and examine it, it starts to blur. And once you've had that thought, once you've really considered it, it's hard to unthink it. I think that's why those concepts stuck with me when nothing else did. They didn't rely on fear in the traditional sense. They relied on doubt, on uncertainty, on the idea that you cannot fully trust what you experience, no matter how normal or safe it seems. A shape-shifting intelligence that understands this would be terrifying not because of what it could do to your body, but because of what it could do to your sense of self, to your understanding of the world, to your confidence in what you know and remember. That kind of horror doesn't end when the story ends. It stays with you. It grows with you. It adapts as your understanding deepens. As a child, it was unsettling. As an adult, it becomes profound and unsettling in a much quieter way. It turns into long thoughts late at night, into moments of existential curiosity that can easily slip into unease. And yet, I find myself drawn to it. These ideas don't repel me. They pull me in. They make my imagination run wild. They open doors to questions that don't have clear answers, and I enjoy exploring them, even when they make me uncomfortable. Especially when they make me uncomfortable. Because fear rooted in thought, in perception, in consciousness itself, that feels more honest to me than any jump scare ever could. I may not be haunted by ghosts or monsters, but I am endlessly fascinated by the idea that reality is not as stable as we believe. And that fascination, mixed with a quiet, lingering unease, is something I've carried with me from childhood into adulthood. It doesn't keep me awake at night in terror. It keeps me awake in thought. And somehow, that feels far scarier. I first came across the story called The Russian Sleep Experiment years ago while reading online late at night. The kind of night where you keep scrolling even though you know you should stop. I didn't expect much when I started reading it. At first, it felt like just another strange internet story, the kind people exaggerate or dress up to sound scarier than it really is. But the more I read, the more it settled into my mind in a way that felt uncomfortable and hard to shake. Even now, years later, I still think about it from time to time. The story is set in the years following World War II, in a version of the Soviet Union where secrecy and fear were normal parts of life. According to the story, a group of political prisoners were offered a deal. These were people who had already been labeled enemies of the state, people whose lives meant very little to those in power. The deal was simple on the surface. If they agreed to participate in a scientific experiment and survived it, they would be granted their freedom. For people with nothing left to lose, it didn't feel like much of a choice at all. The experiment involved sleep, or rather, the complete absence of it. The prisoners were placed together in a sealed chamber. The room was designed so that researchers could observe them through thick glass, but no cameras were used. The technology of the time, according to the story, wasn't advanced enough to function reliably inside the chamber. Instead, the observers relied on microphones to listen to what was happening inside. The room itself was bare and uncomfortable, But the most important detail was the gas that was slowly released into the air. This experimental gas was supposed to keep the subjects awake for 15 days straight. At the beginning, things seemed almost normal. The prisoners talked among themselves, shared stories, and tried to keep their spirits up. They knew they were being watched, and at first, they acted like people who believed they could endure anything if it meant freedom at the end. The first few days passed with nothing particularly alarming. They complained about the discomfort, about the constant light, about how tired they felt, but they were still themselves. As the days went on, subtle changes began to appear. Conversations became tense. Small arguments started over nothing at all. The prisoners became suspicious of one another, questioning motives, accusing each other of things that made no sense. Their sense of time started to slip. They lost track of days, then hours. Sleep deprivation slowly eroded their ability to think clearly, but at first it wasn't obvious just how dangerous that erosion would become. After several days without sleep, one of the prisoners began to scream. Not shout or cry, but scream endlessly, as if something inside him had snapped. He screamed until his voice gave out, and even then, he kept trying, producing nothing but raw, broken sounds. The others tried to calm him, then tried to ignore him, and finally grew afraid of him. The observers outside listened in silence, unsure whether to intervene. The experiment was supposed to push limits, and this, they told themselves, was part of the process. Eventually, the screaming stopped, not because the man had calmed down, but because he could no longer make any sound at all. What was even more disturbing was that the others didn't react the way you might expect. They didn't panic or try to help him. Instead, they became quiet. Too quiet. For long stretches of time, no one spoke. The microphones picked up breathing, movement, and occasional whispers, but there were no normal conversations anymore. As the days continued, the prisoners' behavior became more disturbing. They stopped acting like people who wanted to survive. They stopped caring about their own well-being in ways that were hard to understand. It was as if something had been stripped away from them, something fundamental. The observers noticed that the prisoners were no longer pleading to be let out. In fact, when the researchers spoke to them through the intercom, offering to end the experiment early, the response they got was chilling. The prisoners said they no longer wanted to be freed. That was one of the moments in the story that truly unsettled me. The idea that people who had suffered so much, who had been promised freedom, could reach a point where they no longer wanted it. It suggested that whatever was happening inside that room was deeper than exhaustion or fear. It felt like a complete breakdown of the human desire to survive and escape. By the time the 15 days were nearly over, the researchers could barely recognize the people inside the chamber. The prisoners had changed in ways that were not just physical but psychological. Their movements were slow and strange. Their expressions were empty. It was as if they were no longer fully present in their own bodies. The observers debated what to do. They were afraid of what they might find if they opened the chamber, but they were even more afraid of what it meant to leave it sealed. When the gas was finally turned off and the chamber was opened, the scene inside was beyond anything the researchers had expected. The prisoners who were still alive did not rush for fresh air. They did not beg for help. Instead, they resisted being removed from the room. It was as if the chamber itself had become the only place where they felt complete, or at least familiar. The outside world, with its light and noise and reality, seemed to terrify them. What follows in the story is deeply unsettling, not because of explicit details, but because of what it implies about the human mind. The prisoners had lost something essential during those days without sleep. Whatever it was, it couldn't simply be restored by letting them rest again. The researchers tried to understand what had happened, asking questions, demanding explanations. They wanted a reason, something scientific they could write down and analyze. Near the end of the story, one of the surviving prisoners is briefly revived long enough to answer a question. A researcher asks him what they have become, what the experiment had turned them into. The answer is simple, and that simplicity is what makes it so frightening. He explains that they are what remain when sleep is taken away, that they are the part of the human mind that exists beneath reason, beneath morality, beneath identity. The part that everyone carries inside them, but never has to face because sleep keeps it at bay. The story ends shortly after that, without comfort or resolution. There is no lesson neatly wrapped up, no reassurance that this was all just fiction. And even though you know logically that it is made up, it doesn't feel that way when you're reading it. The tone is clinical, calm, and matter-of-fact, which makes it feel disturbingly real. It reads like a classified report, not a piece of creative writing. What stayed with me wasn't the suffering or the horror in the usual sense. It was the idea behind it all. The suggestion that sleep is not just rest, but a kind of barrier. A reset button that keeps the mind from slipping into something darker. The story makes you wonder what parts of yourself are only kept in check because you close your eyes every night. What thoughts, instincts, or impulses are buried so deep that you never notice them, simply because your mind is allowed to shut down and recover. That idea is far more unsettling than any monster or ghost. It suggests that the scariest things are not external threats, but internal ones. That under the right conditions, anyone could become unrecognizable, not because they are evil, but because they are human. Even now, when I think about the story, it doesn't feel like a traditional horror tale. It feels more like a warning wrapped in fiction, a reminder that the mind has limits, and that pushing past them doesn't lead to enlightenment or strength, but to something raw and unstable. The fact that it's fictional almost doesn't matter. The fear it creates doesn't rely on believing it really happened. It relies on the uncomfortable feeling that something like it could happen, at least in part. That's why it stuck with me. Not because it shocked me in the moment, but because it planted a thought that never fully went away. The idea that beneath our routines, our personalities, and our sense of self, there is something fragile holding it all together. And sometimes, all it takes to loosen that grip is the simple absence of sleep. It happened 3 years ago, at a time when my life was changing very quickly. I had just moved into a student apartment about an hour away from my parents' home. I was only 17, and the move was entirely for my studies. The school I attended was too far for daily travel, and I wanted to learn how to live independently. Convincing my parents had taken months. They were worried, and honestly, I don't blame them now. In the end, after many long conversations and promises that I would be careful and responsible, they finally agreed. My apartment was small, but to me it felt like freedom. It had just enough space for a bed, a desk, a little kitchen area, and a bathroom. I decorated it exactly the way I wanted. I made friends quickly, which helped a lot, and that's where I met Eva, who soon became my best friend. We studied together, ate together, laughed a lot, and supported each other through exams and stress. For a while, everything felt perfect. Things started to change when a new neighbor moved into the apartment next to mine. At first, I didn't even notice him. It wasn't until I came back from a weekend at my parents' house that I realized someone new was living there. There was a new doormat outside the door next to mine, one I hadn't seen before. It didn't seem important at the time, just a small detail in a busy student building. A few days later, I was in the common room of the building. It was a shared space with couches, a small bar area, and a foosball table. Students often gathered there to relax after classes. That evening, I was sitting with Eva and a few other friends when a boy walked in. He looked shy and unsure, like he didn't quite know where he belonged. Eva, being friendly as always, suggested we invite him to sit with us. She went over, talked to him briefly, and brought him back to our table. We introduced ourselves one by one. He didn't say much, mostly smiled and nodded. He seemed reserved, almost nervous, but I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people are shy when they first meet new people. The evening went on normally, and eventually we all went back to our apartments. As Eva and I walked upstairs, she leaned toward me and whispered, half joking, "Did you notice how he kept looking at you? I think he likes you." I smiled it off. At that point in my life, I wasn't interested in dating. My focus was on school, and boys just weren't a priority for me. A few days later, on Wednesday, I went to check my mailbox. It was usually nothing exciting, and that day was no different at first. I had a postcard from my aunt, who was traveling in Italy, and a stack of advertisements. As I flipped through the mail, A small piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. It had my first name written on it. Curious, I picked it up and opened it. Inside it said, "You dress so well, you're more beautiful every day." I smiled. It felt like something out of a romantic TV show, sweet and harmless. I didn't take it seriously. I showed it to Eva later, and we laughed about it, wondering who could have written it. At that point, it didn't scare me at all. Around the same time, I was working part-time at a small restaurant near my school. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped me pay for groceries and occasionally treat myself. One evening during my shift, the boy from the building came in. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Dylan. He sat at the bar, and I went over to take his order. He was very talkative, smiling a lot, even though I was clearly busy with other customers. I noticed later that he stayed for almost 2 hours. I thought it was a bit strange, but I brushed it off. When my shift ended and I was heading home, we walked back to the building at the same time. I was about to say goodbye and go into my apartment when he suddenly hugged me. I froze, completely surprised. He smiled and said, "I'm really happy to have a friend here. You're one of the only ones." That felt odd, considering we barely knew each other, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded and went inside. The next day at school, I ran into him in the hallway. He came straight up to me and started talking. Between classes, we chatted, but I quickly noticed something strange. He asked me a lot of personal questions. Where my parents lived, what my class schedule was, whether I had a boyfriend. When I tried to ask him similar questions, he avoided answering and turned the conversation back to me every time. Over the next few days, I started running into him constantly. Every morning on my way to school. In the evening when I got home. Sometimes even in places where I had never seen him before. It felt too frequent to be a coincidence. I mentioned it to Eva and a few other friends, but they all told me I was probably overthinking it. Maybe we just had similar schedules, they said. One day, while I was cooking dinner in my apartment, the doorbell rang. I assumed it was Eva coming by, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw Dylan standing there, already smiling. I hesitated, but I opened the door anyway. He was holding a box of Ferrero Rocher chocolates. He handed them to me and said, "This is to thank you for being a golden friend." I thanked him and closed the door, feeling slightly uncomfortable but still unsure why. Later that evening, as I sat watching TV and eating the chocolates, something suddenly bothered me. The day before, I had gone grocery shopping with a friend. We had walked past the candy aisle, and she had bought chocolate. I had told her that Ferrero Rocher was my favorite, but that I thought it was too expensive to buy right then. I was certain Dylan hadn't been with us at the store, and I didn't remember ever telling him that. The thought wouldn't leave my mind. I asked Eva if Dylan had mentioned anything to her, but she said no. She hadn't seen him at all. That's when the situation started to feel wrong. As time went on, Dylan kept approaching me more and more. He always wanted to talk, always appeared wherever I was. What had once seemed friendly now felt invasive. I talked to some friends, and they encouraged me to be honest with him. So one morning at school, with my heart pounding, I confronted him. I told him calmly but firmly that his behavior made me uncomfortable. I explained that I felt like he was following me and acting as if we were very close when we weren't. I asked him to keep his distance. His expression changed immediately. He looked hurt, angry, and shocked. It was difficult, but I believed it was the right thing to do. For a short while, things seemed better. Dylan avoided me. Around that time, my cousin came to visit and stayed with me for a couple of days. I barely saw Dylan then, and when I did, he didn't even look at me. I felt relieved. After I walked my cousin to the train station and came back, I ran into Dylan in the hallway. He asked if my cousin was my boyfriend. I told him no, just family. He nodded and went back into his apartment without another word. One evening, I came home and found a bouquet of flowers on my kitchen table with a small note that said, "Happy Holidays." My stomach dropped. Dylan didn't have a key to my apartment. I had never given him permission to enter. Angry and shaken, I took the flowers and went straight to his door. I told him clearly that I wasn't interested and didn't want his gifts. When I asked how he got into my apartment, he casually said the caretaker had let him in. I didn't investigate further at the time, but I should have. One night, at around 3 in the morning, my doorbell rang. I woke up in panic. When I looked through the peephole, the hallway was dark. Then I heard a soft knock, followed by a whisper asking me to open the door. It was Dylan's voice. I was terrified. I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed silent. The knocking grew louder. Then I heard metal scraping. He was trying to force the lock. Shaking, I called the police. I could barely speak, but I gave them my address. I stayed on the line, listening to the noise outside my door, convinced he would get in. Finally, I heard shouting and footsteps. When the police knocked and announced themselves, I opened the door and saw Dylan on the ground in handcuffs. Later, the police told me they had found disturbing information on his phone and laptop. He had tracked my social media, my family, everything. I also learned about his violent past. After that, I moved out. Today, I'm 19, living with my parents again, still afraid to live alone. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand.